There was a time when people believed that the body was completely separate from the mind. If something hurt, the problem was in the body. If you were sick, something had gone wrong physically. If you wanted to change your condition, you had to change the physical condition first. But Neville Goddard proposed something radically different. He believed that the imagination was not simply a place where you created fantasies. He believed imagination was a creative power. And he taught that what you consistently accept as true in consciousness can eventually express itself in your experience. Now think about that for a second. What if your body is not only responding to what happens around you, but also responding to what you repeatedly accept within yourself? What if the image you hold of yourself matters? What if the feeling you repeatedly return to matters? And what if the most important question isn't simply, how do I get rid of this condition? But instead, what would I experience if I were already completely well? This was at the heart of Neville Goddard's teaching. And in this episode, we're going to explore exactly what he meant by it. Not as a replacement for medical treatment, not as a promise that imagination can magically cure every disease, but as a way of understanding one of Neville's most powerful ideas. Your inner state determines the reality you experience. So let's go back to the beginning. Neville Goddard spent much of his life teaching one central principle: assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled. The idea sounds simple, almost too simple, but there's something profound hidden inside it. Most people live by reacting to what they can see. They look at their circumstances. They look at their bank account. They look at their relationships. They look at their body. They look at their symptoms, and then they decide how they feel based on what they see. If everything looks good, they feel hopeful. If something goes wrong, they become afraid. If the body feels pain, they identify with being sick. If the doctor gives them bad news, they immediately begin imagining the worst possible future. In other words, they allow the outside world to determine their internal state. Neville suggested reversing this process. Instead of allowing circumstances to dictate your state, you choose the state first, and then you live from that state. This is where his famous idea of the state of being becomes important. Imagine two people sitting in the same room. They have the same surroundings, the same weather, the same amount of money, the same physical circumstances, but one person feels completely defeated. The other feels hopeful. The external world is almost identical, but their experience of that world is completely different. Why? Because they're occupying different states. And Neville believed that your imagination is the doorway through which you enter those states. Now here's where this becomes particularly interesting when we're talking about the body. Suppose someone is constantly thinking, my body is getting worse. I am fragile. I always get sick. This condition is never going away. What if something is seriously wrong with me? Notice what happens. They're not merely having one thought. They're repeatedly rehearsing an identity. They are repeatedly returning to the state of being someone who is threatened, vulnerable, and unwell. Neville would ask you to consider a completely different approach. Instead of repeatedly imagining yourself as the person who is struggling, what would happen if you began imagining yourself as the person who is already well? Not desperately trying to become well, not begging to become well, not obsessively checking whether you're well yet, but entering the feeling of already being the person you want to be. And this distinction is incredibly important, because there is a huge difference between I want to be healthy and I am experiencing myself as healthy. The first statement places health in the future. The second places health in the present imagination. And Neville's entire philosophy revolves around this movement from desire to assumption. But here's the part people often misunderstand. Neville was not saying that you should deny reality. If you're sick, pretending that you're not sick doesn't automatically make the condition disappear. If you have a medical problem, you shouldn't ignore qualified medical care because you are visualizing a different outcome. His teaching was about consciousness. It was about what you repeatedly accept internally. And that is where we can use his ideas in a practical way. Let's say you're dealing with a health concern. The first thing most people do is imagine the worst. They Google symptoms. They imagine future complications. They picture themselves getting worse. They constantly check their body. They ask, what if this never goes away? What if it gets worse? What if I'm stuck like this? And without realizing it, they are rehearsing the very future they fear. Neville's approach would be to interrupt that rehearsal. Instead of repeatedly asking, what if I get worse? Ask yourself, if I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to be well, how would I feel right now? Don't force an answer. Just imagine. Imagine receiving the message you've been waiting for. Imagine someone telling you everything is fine. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that you feel completely normal. Imagine moving through your day without constantly thinking about your body. Imagine having energy. Imagine laughing with your family. Imagine going for a walk and realizing you haven't thought about your symptoms for hours. And here's the important part. Don't simply see the scene. Feel the relief. Feel the normality. Feel the quietness. Feel what it would be like if the problem were no longer occupying your mind. Neville called this the feeling of the wish fulfilled. The feeling doesn't necessarily have to be intense excitement. In fact, sometimes the most powerful feeling is ordinary. Think about something you already know is true. You don't spend the entire day trying to convince yourself that your name is your name. You simply know it. There's no struggle, no desperation, no constant checking. It's simply accepted. Neville believed that this quality of inner acceptance was enormously powerful, and this gives us our first principle. Step 1. Stop rehearsing the problem. Pay attention to the mental movie you're constantly playing, because you may be trying to create one future consciously while rehearsing another future unconsciously. You say, I want to be healthy, but then spend 20 minutes imagining yourself getting worse. You say, I want peace, but repeatedly replay the argument. You say, I want confidence, but constantly imagine yourself failing. The mind doesn't only respond to what you say you want, it repeatedly returns to what you emotionally rehearse. So begin noticing the rehearsal, not with judgment, with awareness. When you catch yourself imagining the worst, simply stop. You don't have to fight the thought. You don't have to panic about having the thought. Just choose a different direction. Because this brings us to the second principle. Step 2. Create a short scene. Neville frequently taught the use of a short imaginal act, something that implies the wish has already been fulfilled. Keep it simple. Maybe you imagine sitting across from someone you love. They look at you and say, you look amazing, and you smile. Or perhaps someone asks, how are you feeling? And you casually respond, I feel great. That's it. Don't create a 10-minute movie. Create one small scene, something that would naturally happen after the problem has been resolved. Then replay that scene, slowly, quietly, especially before sleep. Because Neville placed enormous importance on the state just before falling asleep. He believed that when the body becomes relaxed and the conscious mind becomes quieter, imagination can become particularly receptive. So instead of falling asleep while worrying about tomorrow, you can deliberately give your mind a different experience. Lie down, relax, close your eyes, and imagine one tiny moment that would be natural if your desired outcome were already true. Then repeat it, not with force, not with desperation, just gently, again and again, until it begins to feel familiar. And that word matters, familiar. Because you're not trying to manufacture some enormous emotional explosion. You're trying to become familiar with a different state. Step 3. Change the inner conversation. Here's something most people never notice. They have conversations all day long, but most of them happen inside their own head. You imagine what someone might say. You imagine what your doctor might say. You imagine what your family thinks. You imagine what will happen tomorrow. You argue with people who aren't even there. You defend yourself. You explain yourself. You predict disasters. Neville called attention to the importance of these inner conversations. So ask yourself, if I were already the person I want to become, what would my inner conversation sound like? Would you constantly say, something is wrong with me? Or would the conversation become calmer? Would you constantly scan for evidence that you're getting worse? Or would you become less obsessed with the problem? Would you constantly ask, when will it happen? Or would you begin to live from the assumption that the change is possible? This doesn't mean suppressing legitimate concerns. It means becoming conscious of what you repeatedly rehearse. Step 4. Live from the end. This may be Neville's most important idea. He called it living from the end. Most people live from the beginning. They say, once this happens, then I'll feel good. Once I'm healthy, I'll relax. Once I have money, I'll feel secure. Once my relationship improves, then I'll be happy. Everything is conditional. But Neville flips the sequence. He says, in effect, enter the state first, then allow your actions to emerge from that state. So instead of asking, what would I do if I were trying to become healthy? Ask, how would I think, feel, and behave if I already believed my body was moving toward wellness? Maybe you would become calmer. Maybe you would take better care of yourself. Maybe you would stop obsessively checking every sensation. Maybe you would follow your treatment plan without constantly imagining catastrophe. Maybe you would sleep differently. Maybe you would stop identifying yourself entirely with the diagnosis. The external action may remain completely practical, but the inner position changes. And that is the crucial distinction. Step 5. Don't make the symptom your identity. This is where Neville's teaching becomes psychologically powerful. There is a difference between I am experiencing a health problem and I am a sick person. The first describes a current experience. The second turns the experience into an identity. And identities are powerful because we naturally behave consistently with them. If you repeatedly tell yourself, I am weak, I am fragile, my body always fails me, this is just who I am, you may begin organizing your entire life around that identity. Neville would encourage you to imagine a different version of yourself. Not someone who is desperately escaping illness, but someone who is simply well. What does that person feel like? How do they walk? How do they sleep? How do they speak? What do they stop worrying about? What becomes normal? Spend time there, because the goal isn't simply to visualize an outcome. It's to experience a different state of consciousness. And now we arrive at the deepest part of this teaching. The state you return to. You don't have to feel positive every second. You don't have to eliminate every fearful thought. You don't have to become spiritually perfect. You're human. Fear will appear. Doubt will appear. Bad days will happen. The question is, where do you keep returning? If fear appears and you return to fear, fear becomes familiar. If doubt appears and you return to doubt, doubt becomes familiar. But if fear appears and you gently return to the state of being okay, that state becomes familiar too. Think of it like walking through a forest. The path you walk repeatedly becomes easier to recognize. Your mind can develop similar patterns. And this is why Neville repeatedly emphasized persistence, not obsessive repetition, not desperation, persistence, returning again and again until the new assumption begins to feel natural, the nightly practice. So here's a simple practice you can try. Before you sleep tonight, don't spend your final few minutes analyzing what's wrong. Instead, ask, what would I experience if I knew that everything was moving toward wellness? Then choose one tiny scene. Maybe you're sitting with someone you love. They look at you and say, you seem so much better. You smile and you say, I know, I feel wonderful. Feel the relief, feel the normality, feel the quiet. Don't force it. Don't strain. Just allow yourself to experience that moment. Then let yourself fall asleep with that feeling. And tomorrow, live your life. Take appropriate care of your body. Seek medical help when you need it. Take your treatment seriously. Eat well, sleep, move. Do the practical things that support your health. But alongside all of that, become aware of the story you're telling yourself. Because perhaps one of the most important questions isn't, what's wrong with me? Perhaps sometimes the more useful question is, who am I becoming through the way I think about myself every day? And this is where Neville Goddard's teaching ultimately takes us. He wasn't simply teaching people to visualize things. He was teaching them to question the identity from which they were living. Because if you constantly imagine yourself as someone who is struggling, you keep returning to the state of struggle. But if you begin repeatedly experiencing yourself as someone who is capable, peaceful, strong, and well, you begin practicing a different identity. Whether you describe that as imagination, consciousness, faith, psychology, or simply changing the way you relate to your experience, the practice itself can be deeply transformative. But remember the distinction. Imagination is not a substitute for medicine. You don't have to deny your symptoms. You don't have to reject doctors. You don't have to pretend that illness isn't real. You can care for the physical body while also becoming conscious of the mental and emotional world you repeatedly inhabit. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of the idea. You don't have to wait until everything outside of you changes before you allow yourself to experience peace. You can begin there, tonight, in the quiet. Close your eyes, take a breath, and imagine, just for a moment, that the thing you've been worrying about has already been resolved. Not someday, not eventually, but now. Imagine what it feels like to wake up without fear, to move without constantly checking your body, to laugh without thinking about the problem, to look in the mirror and recognize yourself again. Stay there for a moment and then let that feeling become familiar, because maybe the first step isn't forcing your body to become something different. Maybe the first step is learning to stop living every moment as though the worst possible outcome is already inevitable. And perhaps the question isn't simply, how do I heal my body? Perhaps the deeper question is, what version of myself am I practicing becoming every single day? Because Neville's message was ultimately about this: change the state you live from, and then let your life unfold from there. If this message has spoken to something within you, if you felt that quiet recognition that perhaps your inner world deserves just as much attention as your outer world, then don't let this moment end here. Subscribe to Stories and Quotes Be. Here we explore the timeless ideas of Neville Goddard: imagination, consciousness, self-concept, faith, and the extraordinary power of the assumptions you carry within. Every video is an invitation to pause, to reflect, and to remember the power that already exists within your own imagination. So if you're ready to explore more deeply, subscribe to Stories and Quotes Be. And when you do, don't simply subscribe to a channel. Subscribe to the journey of becoming. Because every assumption is a seed. Every inner conversation is a rehearsal. Every feeling you return to is shaping the state from which you live. So tonight, before you close your eyes, ask yourself one final question. Who would I be if the wish were already fulfilled? Then enter that state. Feel it, accept it, and return to it again and again until it feels natural. This is Stories and Quotes Be. And remember, you are not merely imagining a different life. You are practicing the state from which that life can be experienced. Until the next episode, keep imagining, keep believing, keep returning to the end, and most importantly, become the person who already lives there.